Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the way you talk about your toughest experiences could reveal something about your mental health? Well, this new study might have a clue. Today we're diving into how our words, especially when we describe traumatic events, can be a window into detecting PTSD symptoms. Imagine you've gone through something really difficult. How you tell that story, the details you share, the emotions you express, it all paints a picture. Researchers are getting really interested in whether we can use computers to analyze these stories and spot signs of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. This is a big deal because getting help early for PTSD can make a huge difference. The big question this study tackled was, can we build a computer program, a classifier, that can tell if someone is experiencing high or low PTSD symptoms just by reading their written stories about traumatic life events? They used something called natural language processing, or NLP, which is basically teaching computers to understand and interpret human language. So, how did they do it? They gathered 150 people and asked them to write about 3 different kinds of life events. First, they wrote about the most traumatic thing that ever happened to them. Then they wrote about a negative event that wasn't quite traumatic. And finally, they wrote about a completely neutral event. Along with these stories, everyone filled out questionnaires to measure their PTSD symptoms, as well as levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. Now, here's where the cool tech comes in. Computers don't actually read like we do. So, the researchers used special computer models called semantic embedding models to turn each story into a set of numbers. Think of it like giving each story a unique numerical fingerprint that captures its meaning. These numerical fingerprints can then be used to train machine learning models. And what did they find? The computer programs, the classifiers that were trained on the stories about traumatic events were actually pretty good at predicting who had high PTSD symptoms and who had low symptoms. They got an AWK of 0.734. Now, what is AWK? Think of it like a score for how well a test can distinguish between two groups. A score of 1.0 is perfect, and 0.5 is like guessing. So, 0.734 is a solid result. It means the program was significantly better than just random chance, and even better than a simpler method that just counted words. Here is a really key finding. When they tried to use the stories about negative or neutral events to predict PTSD symptoms, the computer programs didn't do much better than chance. This is super important because it suggests that the signal for PTSD is specifically in the way people talk about traumatic memories, not just any negative event. It is the unique processing of trauma that seems to hold the key. Another interesting piece of the puzzle, even though people with high PTSD symptoms also tended to report higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress, the computer programs trained on the trauma stories couldn't reliably predict these other symptoms. This reinforces the idea that the language used in trauma narratives contains a signal that is specific to PTSD, rather than just general distress. So, what is the big takeaway? This study is showing that the way we narrate our most traumatic experiences can contain valuable information about our current PTSD symptoms. It's not just about what happened, but how we process and express it through language. This could be a new, less intrusive way to screen for potential PTSD, especially in situations where getting a clinical diagnosis might be difficult or delayed. The researchers used a few different types of computer models to see which one worked best. They compared logistic regression, support vector machines, and gradient-boosted trees. For this particular task, the support vector machine, or SVM, turned out to be the winner, giving them the best prediction performance. They were really careful to make sure their results weren't just a fluke. They used something called nested cross-validation, which is like repeatedly testing their model on different parts of the data to make sure it was consistently good. They also used permutation testing, which is a fancy way of saying they shuffled the labels around to see if their model was actually learning something real or just getting lucky. The fact that their results held up under these rigorous tests gives us more confidence in what they found. They also compared their fancy number-based language models to a more basic approach that just counted words. Their advanced models, the ones using those numerical fingerprints, performed significantly better. This tells us that the meaning and context of the words are really important, not just how often they appear. Interestingly, when they looked at what people thought about their stories, like how vivid or emotional they were, those subjective ratings didn't predict PTSD symptoms, as well as the actual language used in the stories did. This is another piece of evidence that the linguistic content itself is the key signal. One limitation of the study is that while they could predict overall PTSD symptom levels, they couldn't reliably predict specific clusters of PTSD symptoms like intrusion, avoidance, or arousal. This might mean that the signal detected is more about the overall burden of symptoms rather than specific symptom patterns. More research is needed here. When they dug a little deeper into the language itself, they found that people with higher PTSD symptoms used more anxiety-related words in their trauma narratives. This makes intuitive sense and adds another layer of understanding to how language reflects psychological states. Now, it is important to talk about what this study can't do. They used the self-report questionnaire, the PCL-5, to measure PTSD symptoms. This is a great tool, but it is not the same as a formal diagnosis from a trained clinician. So, this study shows the potential for detecting symptoms. But we can't yet say it can diagnose PTSD. Also, their participants were mostly university students, not people actively seeking treatment. So, while it is promising, we need to be careful about generalizing these findings to everyone. Think of this study as a really important first step, a proof of concept. It shows that this approach is possible and has real potential. The researchers themselves say that large-scale application isn't feasible yet, and that the results need to be reproduced with more data. Scroll conclusion, the present study investigated whether a machine learning classifier could estimate PTSD symptoms in otherwise healthy individuals based on linguistic characteristics of autobiographical narratives describing their most traumatic life events. Inclusion, so what does this mean for us? It's a fascinating look into how our language can be a powerful indicator of our inner world. It highlights the unique way our brains process traumatic memories and how that processing might be reflected in the words we choose. This research opens doors for potentially developing new accessible tools for mental health screening, especially in areas where resources are limited. Imagine being able to get a preliminary understanding of someone's potential PTSD symptoms just by analyzing their written experiences. The scientists have even shared all their code online, which is fantastic for transparency and allows other researchers to build upon their work. That is a great sign of open science. It is also interesting to note that the authors mention using AI for things like spell checking, which is becoming increasingly common in research today. Future research could involve larger and more diverse groups of people, including those who have received clinical diagnoses. It would also be great to see if combining language analysis with other types of data, like maybe even voice analysis, could further improve accuracy. Overall, this study is a compelling example of how we can harness the power of technology and language to gain deeper insights into mental health. It's a reminder that the stories we tell and the way we tell them hold a lot of power. What do you think about this research? Does it surprise you that the way we talk about trauma could be so telling? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into psychology research, be sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more mind-bending science, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.